Okay, well, thank you, everybody, for coming on this very rainy day. Glad to see so many people here. I'm Linda Feldman. I'm the Washington Bureau Chief for the Christian Science Monitor. Our guest today is Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff of California, Chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. This is his 7th appearance at a Monitor breakfast, so welcome. Now, a little bit of background. Chairman Schiff is originally, I have to say this, from the great Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And eventually landed in California, where he's been pretty much ever since. He went to Stanford and then headed back east for Harvard Law. And then after a stint in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Los Angeles, he was elected to the California State Senate. Then in 2000, elected to the House and has won re-election ever since. In 2019, he became chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. Early last year, he served as lead manager in the first impeachment trial of President Trump, and today he is a member of the House Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Now for the ground rules. We are on the record. Please, no live blogging or tweeting. In short, no filing of any kind while the breakfast is underway. And then once the session ends at 9:15, there's no embargo. We will email pictures and a rough transcript from this breakfast to all the reporters here as soon as the breakfast ends. And as you know, if you'd like to ask a question, just send me a signal and I will call on as many of you as time permits. Now, Congressman Schiff, if you'd like to make brief opening remarks, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much, and I'm going to take this off while I'm speaking also. Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it, and I've enjoyed these breakfasts over the years and look forward to the conversation today. I thought what I would start out discussing is the introduction of the Protecting Our Democracy Act, which we introduced this week, and we are proud to have, I think, over 115 co-sponsors on it already, and about 150 good government organizations who are endorsing the measure. It's a broad package of reforms designed to be responsive to many of the weaknesses we found in our democratic system over the last 4 years. So among the reforms in the package, I think the most important may be a provision that expedites the enforcement of congressional subpoenas. What we found over the last 4 years is that if a president decides to stonewall the subpoenas, they can do so pretty effectively and draw Congress out of the courts almost indefinitely. And if you look at the litigation involving Don McGahn, you can see just how long it takes to reach any resolution. That litigation, I think, took over 2 years. We have had to go up to the Supreme Court, up through the District Court, Court of Appeals, Supreme Court, come back to the District Court, and go back towards the Supreme Court again. And if administration can simply do that, even when its claims are without merit, then the congressional power to oversee is effectively nullified. And as courts have recognized, Congress must have power to compel answers if it's to legislate effectively. It's a core part of our responsibility. The bill also tries to provide an enforcement mechanism for the Emoluments Clause, something we discovered isn't really clearly provided for in terms of how to effectuate that provision of the Constitution. We want to make sure that no future president can use the Oval Office to enrich themselves, whether it's by renting hotel rooms to Gulf nations that don't even use the rooms, or through any other means to allow foreign or domestic parties to curry favor with the chief executive by violating the Emoluments Clause. We stiffen penalties for the Hatch Act so that we don't have senior political officials violating the Hatch Act with impunity, and when they're recommended for firing by the special counsel of the ethics office, their response is blah, blah, blah. What are you going to do about it, essentially? And we obviously don't want to see political conventions on federal property like White House grounds. So we will be, through this package, stiffening the penalties for violating that provision. We attack the problem of failure to ascertain the winner of the election. If the bureaucracy at the Office of Management Budget refuses to make an ascertainment, we want to make sure that after 5 days that both candidates can begin the transition process and begin briefing and establishing their team. We also try to attack the abuse of the pardon power by requiring disclosure of records involving pardons given to members of the president's family. We clarify that the president cannot pardon himself or herself. We told the statute of limitations so that the president cannot commit crimes in office, before office, and escape prosecution by passage of the statute of limitations. And we also try to attack the usurpation of Congress's power of the purse and strengthen the Impoundment Act and probably about a dozen other fixes that have been made necessary by experience over the last 4 years. We hope that it will prompt a response by Congress, much like the Congress after Watergate responded to the abuses of the Nixon administration. And although these fixes have been demonstrated as necessary by the last administration, this bill is about more than one errant and immoral president. It's about all future presidents. And we want to make sure that no president in the future of either party can flout the institutions of our democracy the way we saw the last 4 years. So that's where we are on the Protecting Our Democracy Act, and happy to respond to questions on that, or, of course, anything else that's going on with the Select Committee, with infrastructure, reconciliation. I'll do my best, and really appreciate, again, the opportunity to meet with you today.
Great, thank you. So I'll start with a few questions, and then we'll move to reporters around the room. So you first introduced this legislation a year ago, and I'm curious how this version is different. In other words, how did events of the past year affect the plan that you just put out?
We did make some important changes to the legislation, in part because we had to respond to new problems that grew up after the introduction of the last bill, such as the problem of a failure to ascertain that ministerial step. And when I say failure to ascertain, I obviously don't mean a failure to figure out who won. Who won was clear, but the ministerial step of making ascertainment by the Office of Management Budget did not take place. There was enormous pressure placed on the bureaucracy not to do so. And as a result, there was a significant delay in the Biden administration's efforts at transition. So that was a problem that came up after the introduction of the bill last year. We also added provision providing for disclosure of tax returns for 10 years of presidential candidate. And over the last several months, we worked with the administration to try to address concerns that the current administration had. We certainly fully anticipated that no matter who's in the executive office, they jealously guard the prerogatives of that office and that branch. And so we worked to accommodate concerns that were raised about, for example, personalizing individuals who refuse to comply with a subpoena. We provided a carve-out where there's a claim of privilege and where the executive specifies that they specifically ask the individual not to comply. So we did provide a safe harbor there, and made some other tweaks to the bill to try to accommodate administration concerns. We have not been able to reach full agreement on all the provisions of the bill, so that will continue to be a work in progress.
Even with the White House, you and the White House are still working out language?
Yes. I mean, there were areas that we felt we could accommodate and did. There are areas where we felt we could not.
So where are the problems?
Well, I don't want to get into too much detail because we're still negotiating, and it probably won't aid negotiation if I go into too much detail. But I think the administration has raised reasonable points with respect to different provisions, and we're continuing to work it through. But we've been doing that for several months now, and we decided we needed to move forward and use the rest of the process to resolve any remaining concerns.
I mean, for example, if the Republicans take over the House in the next election, that obviously changes the posture between the White House and Congress. Is that a concern?
Well, I'm confident we will maintain control
Okay.
of the House. But just as we have to be concerned in Congress with whoever occupies that office, these protections are really, we don't expect to have to use them against the current administration. But they also need to be mindful of what future Congresses might do. And so, for example, in the discussion we've had over expedition of congressional subpoenas, the White House wants to make sure that that doesn't obviate the need for Congress to try to reach accommodation with the executive. And so we added language to make that clear. But at the same time, in Congress, we simply can't abide another situation where the administration can simply say, we're going to ignore any compulsion from Congress.
So one more from me, and then Rick Klein. So your comments that you've been making the last few days on this legislation are, at heart, an indictment of the Republican Party for essentially not reining in Donald Trump, it sounds like. But you need a significant number of Republicans to pass this, to get this through the Senate. So what can you really accomplish here?
Well, a lot of these reforms had not only Republican support, but Republican sponsors in the past. And I think what the Republican members of the House and Senate will need to decide is whether the coercion of the former president, the fear of the former president, is sufficient to override what they always felt was good policy in the past. It's still good policy, and it's made more necessary by the obvious events of the last 4 years. But I recognize there's a lot of fear of the former president, and that fear has been a powerful motivator for 4 years. I would hope that fear doesn't outweigh the need to protect our democracy against some very clear, now demonstrated vulnerabilities.
All right. Rick Klein from ABC.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for doing this. And this question, I think, builds on this conversation and the new legislation that you put forward. As a member of the January 6th Commission, a lot of the issues that are likely to come up with regard to subpoenas are things that you're very familiar with through the impeachment process. And it's a unique set of circumstances where, as you move to the subpoena phase, you're going to be asking for former Trump administration officials, but the Biden Justice Department may have a lot to say about whether they should cooperate, whether you can compel the testimony. Have you gotten any assurances from the Biden Justice Department you expect full cooperation if you get to the point where you need to enforce a subpoena and get someone, a former White House aide, to cooperate with the commission?
I think so far what we've seen from the Biden administration has been very encouraging. They made it clear that, for example, with respect to Congress's request for information from prior Justice Department officials about efforts to dragoon that department into a coercive force against the state of Georgia, to certify a false set of electors or decertify the appropriate electors, that they would not stand in the way of Congress getting the information. And I think that's a very encouraging sign. This administration, and like any other, I would not expect would give us a blank check and say we're going to never assert privilege or never support an assertion of privilege. But I think the indications are very positive. And that will be the most substantial difference between now and what we saw over the last 4 years, which is we hope to be pushing on an open door in a way that we were confronting a president who was fighting all subpoenas for 4 years.
Are you concerned at all about the pace of the investigation so far, having this, particularly with the experience through the impeachment? It takes a long time to get stuff done, and we're sitting here now, it's late September, and there haven't even been subpoenas, much less any cooperation.
Yeah. I'm not concerned with how we're conducting the investigation in terms of our pace, because I think our pace has been extraordinarily rapid. If you compare where we are to where the 9/11 Commission was At a similar time, I think we are quite a bit advanced of that. Now, we had to stand up our staffing, which we're coming close to concluding. And while we were doing it, we were holding a hearing and we were requesting documents. And so in terms of what we're doing, I feel very confident we're doing everything we can and with great alacrity. In terms of the tyranny of the calendar, it is a concern because I have been through now 2 massive investigations, one of Russia, one of Ukraine, and I know how time-consuming they are, even if you have administration cooperation. Because certainly there will be some who will not be cooperating with us, and I'm not referring to the current administration, but members of the past administration. We have to anticipate that. And we don't have, until we have passage of the Protecting Our Democracy Act, there'll still be opportunities to try to draw things out in court. So that is a concern. But we may have additional tools now that we didn't before, including a Justice Department that may be willing to pursue criminal contempt when people deliberately flout compulsory process.
Thank you.
Hugo Lowell from The Guardian.
Just wanted to follow up on a couple of the previous questions. I mean, you've now sent records requests to NARA, and Trump's legal team is being led by a former colleague of yours, Doug Collins. Do you anticipate there will be court challenges that will lead you maybe not to get all the records you requested?
I think we have to anticipate that there are going to be people who don't want to talk because they feel it would incriminate them or incriminate others. And so while we would hope that people would voluntarily comply, we have to contemplate that that's not going to be true of everyone. And we are determined to move expeditiously and not allow weeks and weeks to go by after making voluntary requests, and moving quickly to compulsion where that's necessary, and moving quickly to litigation where that's necessary. And that's all we can do. I would hope that the support of the public and the public's demand for answers would help apply pressure and compel rapid acquiescence in our requests, but time will tell.
And then you mentioned kind of contempt for Congress, for people who might defy the subpoenas. I mean, do you think you might push it all the way to inherent contempt? I mean, how is the Select Committee going to overcome the difficulties that impeachment faced with stonewalling from administration officials?
I think we will discuss and decide what are the mechanisms we're going to use. None of them are a complete answer, which is part of the reason why we need reform. Even if we were to move forward with inherent contempt, there are ways for people who are the subject of inherent contempt to litigate that. If you, for example, use it, if we were to revive inherent contempt and use it to fine people who are non-cooperative, you have to have a mechanism of garnering their wages to accomplish that, and you have to go to court to effectuate that. And so there are no perfect remedies here, but the prospect of a potential criminal prosecution by the Justice Department is something that those who willfully and bad faith resist cooperating when they're compelled to do so will have to consider. And that was never a concern of people in the last 4 years. Bill Barr was not going to enforce the law when it didn't serve the president. And that's a very different situation than we face today.
John Gizzi from Newsmax.
Yeah, thank you, Linda. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, again. I have 2 questions on disparate subjects. We've seen conservative Republican members of Congress question whether the January 6th defendants are getting their rights while they're incarcerated. What do you, as a member of the committee, say about them, the January 6th Commission, I should say to that? Are they getting their rights?
Yes, they are, and I think it is another dangerous turn for the Congress and the country that you have members of Congress trying to lionize people who attacked Capitol Police officers, gravely injured them, to try to portray them as political prisoners or hostages, is not only completely at odds with the truth, but dangerous. It just continues the dangerous trend that led us into January 6th. And I think among the most destructive things of the last 4 years in the last administration was the whole attack on the truth. And the idea that people are entitled to their own alternate facts, or as Giuliani said, the truth isn't somehow truth. And those that are trying to portray these insurrectionists as political prisoners or claiming that their rights are being violated are just continuing the big lie in a different form.
And the other question is, so they're getting their rights like any prisoner, that's what I'm saying.
They're getting their rights like any defendant in a criminal process.
The other thing is, putting on your hat from the Intelligence Committee, there have been reports, and certainly is making a splash on social media about Haiti. The Digicel, the provider, has a call from Prime Minister Henry to one of the fugitives in the assassination of President Mossi. Is this something that has ever come up in discussion of Haiti, or you're familiar with?
I'm not familiar with that allegation.
Okay.
All right, Jerry Zrumsky from the Buffalo News.
Good morning. Thanks for doing this. I have two questions on disparate topics as well. First of all, on the January 6th commission. Last September, Michael Caputo, who was then at HHS, in Facebook Live video predicted violence after President Trump refused to stand down after the election. That being the case, are you planning on possibly calling him as a witness to talk about what he may have known about planning of what happened on January 6th?
At this point, we're not prepared to identify specific witnesses that we intend to call. But we've also made it very clear that no one is off limits, that anyone that has relevant information about the events of January 6th, and if that's someone who is predicting violence, that could be very relevant. Now, it could be a case where someone is predicting violence but has no knowledge, in fact, that violence will occur. Or it could be, or individuals may have had actual knowledge of an intention to commit violent acts to try to interfere with a peaceful transfer of power. Our committee will seek answers to those questions, but I can't say with respect to any specific person at this point whether we'll be interested in them.
Okay, and on your proposed reforms to the pardon power, would they address pardons that seem to be politically motivated, such as President Trump's pardon of Chris Collins, your former colleague, who was the first member of the House to endorse the president?
I think there are limits to our ability constitutionally to affect the pardon power. And we've worked carefully with the House General Counsel and constitutional scholars to try to figure out where those limits are. And so even in the case of a president who wanted to pardon their son, for example, we don't prohibit that pardon, but we say that those investigative files should be provided to Congress so that Congress can determine whether that pardon is an effort to obstruct justice, for example, if that son were potentially a cooperating witness. We also prohibit pardons if they were part of a bribe. So if a political supporter was in trouble and was willing to do something for the president, and the president offered to give them a pardon if they were held in violation of the law, we make clear that that would be a crime. So it would, in terms of the case that you mentioned, it would I think, not likely apply unless one of those other conditions was also present.
Right. Are you Joseph Clark?
I'm Joseph Clark.
Okay, from the Washington Times.
Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate your time. I wanted to ask, I have a couple questions On Afghanistan, so we saw last week Secretary Blinken testify. Next week we'll be seeing leadership from the Pentagon testify before Congress. I'm wondering, from your perspective, what open questions do you have, if any, and what do you expect to learn going forward? And then, as a separate question, going forward, the administration has proposed an over-the-horizon counterterrorism strategy to address the threat in the region. From an intelligence perspective, I mean, that strategy would rely on a robust ability to collect and to establish pattern of life in the country. Do you see any gaps in that strategy, given we've pulled out completely U.S. troops, but also our embassy currently is closed? And I'd just like your perspective on that strategy and what questions you may have going forward.
Thank you. On the first question, what issues am I interested in? What questions do I have? I would put them, I guess, in a few different categories. The first, we were there for 20 years, and we had at least two objectives during those 20 years. The first was to prevent another 9/11 attack, and in that we were successful. The second was to help the Afghans stand up a government that would be respectful of the rights of its people and women and girls, that would be a representative form of government. It wouldn't look exactly like ours, but it would be representative of the different people within Afghanistan. And it would defend itself. And after 20 years, multiple administrations, and the loss of thousands of American lives and the expenditure of trillions of dollars, that failed. The government collapsed, and it collapsed in rapid order. And I'd like to think there were some lasting positive impacts in terms of the effect we had on the Afghan people. But the government did not defend itself. It did not earn sufficient support among the Afghan people to defend itself against the Taliban. And so I think that ought to prompt very thorough review to determine why that 20-year effort did not succeed, and what that says about the limits of our ability to build democracies, and the limits of the use of military power, and I think that's among the most important questions for us to answer, and I think it will take us a long time to answer that question. I think there are also very important questions about the end state of our presence in Afghanistan. And in the committee, we've been looking at the intelligence over the last couple of years. What were the agencies saying about the staying power of the government, about the ability of the Taliban to retake power? And we're still in the midst of that. But I think say generally that the IC continually over the last couple of years provided increasingly pessimistic assessments of the Afghan government's ability to maintain itself. And while I don't think anyone predicted that I have seen an intelligence product that the government would collapse in 11 days or however many days it took, nonetheless the trend was pretty clear. And as time passed on and you saw surrenders of different provinces, you could see the acceleration of the fall of the government. And so one of the questions I have is, what did the military plan for in terms of our evacuation? Normally the military has plans for everything, for every contingency. And even though this was not the most likely assessment, that it would collapse within a matter of days, I'd like to know what the military planned for and how that military plan was executed or not executed. So I think we have to take a very cold, objective look at the end state of our presence there. And I would include in that, and we have already held one hearing where we looked into this extensively, a look at the strike that killed over a dozen civilians, what went wrong, and this is an issue that several committees are going to have to look at, and we've already started to do that. One of the targets of that strike worked for a nonprofit out of my district, or very closely adjacent, out of Pasadena. And particularly as we are going to be moving to an over-the-horizon strategy, we need to understand exactly what went wrong and what that means in terms of the limits of what we're able to do. Getting to that question of the over-the-horizon strategy, I think that our intel people have made clear and publicly that there are risks that will increase over time without the presence that we've had, without the large military footprint. I still believe that's the right decision to withdraw, even in light of that increased prospect of risk. We can't occupy everywhere where there's a risk if we're not present. Today, there is a greater risk from other parts of the world than there is in Afghanistan in terms of terrorism. But we're going to have to keep a very close eye on whether al-Qaeda reconstitutes itself, what ISIS-K is able to do, and we do have some, important and powerful capabilities, but it's not the same as being there. And at the same time, the longer that we are there in significant numbers, the more that our people are at risk in terms of our service members. So, right decision, but still risks that we're going to have to keep an eye on.
May I ask just a very quick follow-up? So regarding the increasingly pessimistic intelligence assessments and your question over the military's plan for all contingencies, is your question solely on the military plan, or do you have any questions about the State Department's involvement in the withdrawal as well, and sort of their role in planning as well?
No, yes, I do, and in particular the SIV process, so that I think those are very important questions we need to answer as well. And even as we are looking at why we were not able to get more of the SIVs out, we have to work on getting the SIVs out. So this is not all retrospective. It's also a very contemporary and ongoing need.
Thank you.
Krista Case-Bryant from the Monitor, to your right.
Thank you for being here, Chairman. I had a question related to the SolarWinds attack, and just wondering to what extent your committee has been able to determine whether there was information collected during that attack that could be used for a future attack, and if so, what the scope of that might be. And also, do you see any relationship between such cyber attacks from Russian actors and Russia's overall strategy of deploying sort of active measures 2.0 against our country, including the kind of disinformation that we saw around the 2016 election?
I think we are still very much in the process of damage assessment from SolarWinds, as well as some of the other very serious hacking efforts. And I think it will take quite a while to get our arms around what additional exposure we have as a result of that hack and what the secondary impacts are. And my guess is we may not completely know. Some of these sophisticated actors, it's very difficult to tell whether they've been completely expunged. And so that process is ongoing. What does it mean in terms of Russian active measures, the likelihood of further hacks, and I would also add ransomware attacks? I don't think we've established a sufficient deterrent, either the United States or the international community, to deter either future major hacks or ransomware attacks. The calculus on the hacks is a bit different than the ransomware attacks. If a nation believes that its national security or foreign policy interests are going to be advanced by a hack, you need a very powerful deterrent to change the calculus such that they believe it would put them in more jeopardy rather than give advantage from a hack. I'm not sure that we have done enough to change the calculus. So regrettably, I think we're going to have to foresee other major attacks, and we're going to have to try, and I know the administration is, to define where the line is that can't be crossed, where you're putting such a large online ecosystem at risk through a hack that it demands a very powerful international response. With respect to ransomware, these groups, whether they're in Russia or China or Iran or elsewhere, have a symbiotic relationship often with the host government, where they can operate with impunity on their soil as long as they don't go after local industry and the nation-state government, and as long as their actions don't provoke a too strong reaction against the nation host. They can also be called upon to do hacking at the state's behest. And given that symbiotic relationship between some of these ransomware groups and host governments, I think we have to hold the host governments responsible for these ransomware attacks. And in multiple ways, I think by using the tools that we have, and there's already been public discussion of some of our efforts along those lines. But I also think we need to develop an international rule of the road and understanding that if a nation is not taking action against ransomware crime groups operating on their soil, that the international community will sanction them to the degree of the cost. And that will be essentially an automatic mechanism to be enforced by the international community. And I think we're at very infant stages of trying to organize that, but it seems to me unless the nations are going to have to pay for the theft, they're not going to be deterred sufficiently to crack down on these groups. And I fully expect that they have ability to crack down on them should they choose to. And if any of them tried to hack their host governments the way they have tried to hack and ransom us, they would be shut down overnight. So those are some of the steps I think we need to take.
Just a quick follow-up on the disinformation part. Do you have any sense that, like, in the SolarWinds attack, they were trying to gather information that they could then use to manipulate public opinion, public attitudes toward the government, public attitudes toward democracy in general, and try to undermine trust in the government through that attack or similar?
I don't yet have enough visibility on the motive to tell you whether that was part of the goal or not. But I think we've seen enough in terms of Russian behavior over the last couple of years to know they're not stopping. And the Europeans and the Germans are already pushing back against Russian interference in their elections, and I think we can expect this is going to be a part of the background of every election. And it's only a question of how much we're able to suppress it. How overt is it? Do the Russians, again, try to overtly hack institutions, overtly dump documents? Do they restrain their activity to pushing out divisive themes online or amplifying narratives that divide the country or promote one candidate over another? At present, I have to fully expect they're going to continue to do that until they pay a price for it. And at this point, I think their calculus is they've not had to pay much of a price, and that they have gained such benefit from it, particularly their activities in 2016, that it's an incredibly cost-effective way to help choose the government they want in other parts of the world, and also divide their enemies internally. And so, sadly, I have to expect they're going to continue unless we find a way to provide a more compelling deterrent.
Mike Lillis from The Hill, to your right.
Thank you, Chairman Schiff. Two questions on two different topics. And the first is a little bit out of your realm, but House Democrats are going to have a pretty busy week coming up. So I was wondering if you can walk us through how you see this playing out after the meeting to the White House. Big infrastructure vote on Monday. Guy Paul said she has 50 progressives who could kill it. Wondering if you think that would be the end of this process. Nobody reconciliation will be ready by then. So how is this going to play out? How are Democrats going to realize Biden's agenda?
I don't think it's the end of the process at all. Whether we vote on Monday and it goes down, or we don't vote because it would go down, I don't expect that we'll be able to wrap this all up by Monday. But whether it takes one form or the other on Monday, I think it's just one stage in the process that we have to go through to get to the final package. And so I view this as just the initial phase of getting to yes on the overall package. And I'm very confident we're going to get to yes and pass a package that includes the infrastructure, physical infrastructure, and the Build Back Better Act. And I'm confident of it for two reasons. The first is that on a policy basis, the country desperately needs it. And I think combined with what we did in the rescue plan will be among the most important investments in the American people since the New Deal. And I think it's an unmitigated positive for the nation. So on a policy basis, it's absolutely imperative. On a political basis, it's absolutely imperative. And there's just no room for failure here. And I think everyone in our caucus understands that imperative. This has to get done. And so those two imperatives being as strong as they are, I just don't see failure as an option. So whatever happens on Monday is, I view as just a part of the process, a part of the negotiation. Everybody is trying to maximize their leverage in the negotiation that gets us to the ultimate deal. But I have every confidence we will get to that ultimate deal.
Got it. Second question is on Havana syndrome. You've been briefed on this, and knowing that you can't talk about confidential information. Based on what you've heard, what is your best guess about what is causing these?
I feel still a strong degree of humility about being able to give you a best guess because it could be completely wrong. And we're not ruling anything out. It's also possible that not all of these incidents, not all of these anomalies are attributable to the same cause. And at the same time, the seriousness of the injuries and the proliferating nature of these anomalies demands our full deployment of resources across the government to find out. We're obviously making important strides in making sure that those affected get immediate treatment and are advised about what they need to do and that they need to do it quickly to minimize the injuries. And I think we've made a lot of improvements in terms of how the whole government is treating those who are suffering from these anomalies, these attacks. There's certainly many of them that seem quite deliberate. And what the cause is and what the motivation is, what the intent is, I think these are still very much open questions. But I do think that we are getting closer to some of the answers and bringing new tools to bear to help us get those answers. So we'll figure this out. And if a nation-state actor is behind it, or more than one nation-state actor, and these are deliberate attacks, were there efforts undertaken with the knowledge that they're causing people physical injury? I'm also confident there'll be very serious repercussions.
But you're calling them attacks, so you're convinced that there is an external force.
Again, I want to admit of the possibility that there are a variety of causes, and so I don't know is the answer, but certainly some of them seem quite deliberate, and but I'm going to await final judgment.
So I'll throw one in. So did Donald Trump permanently change the presidency? And how do you, so much of what he did that was unusual was sort of going out of the norms of the presidency, right? So how do you legislate new norms?
Yeah. Did he permanently change the presidency? That really depends on us, whether we allow a future president to engage in the kind of corrupt conduct that we saw during the last 4 years. And I have to hope that he didn't change the presidency permanently, but he prompted a reaction to restore our checks and balances. But time will tell. We did learn that, as you intimate, that any number of norms that we thought were inviolate, that provided a lot of the protection of our democratic institutions, it turns out you can violate, and you can do it with impunity, provided that one party is willing to go along with it. The founders understood the danger of excessive factionalism, and they did everything they could to pit ambition against ambition to try to overcome the deleterious impact of excessive factionalism. But they knew it was a risk, and they knew it might not work. And it did work. We got through the last 4 years, but not without extraordinary damage. And one way you can make those norms inviolate is or if not inviolate, at least more difficult to violate, is by enshrining them in law and increasing the penalties for the violation, and ensuring that if at least one of the houses is not controlled by the party of the president, or even if it is controlled by the party of the president, is not so beholden to the president that it's unwilling to undertake its constitutional duty, that body, that House or that Senate, can enforce some of these norms. So in the reform package, for example, we allow one House or the other or both to enforce the emoluments clause, and we allow one House, one committee, or even a subcommittee to enforce its subpoenas. Now, exposure can be a really powerful thing, and it could be a very powerful deterrent. But we had a lot of corrupt conduct exposed over the last 4 years, and it still didn't prove to be enough. And I think at the end of the day, no matter how brilliantly the Constitution may be drafted, no matter what we're able to do, however modest by comparison by statute, if one party or a large number of its members is not willing to observe both the spirit of the law as well as the letter of it, our democracy is always going to be at risk.
So, and you often mention the example of, I think it's a Gulf state, renting a hotel room at the Trump Hotel and then not even using it as sort of an effort to curry favor with the administration. I mean, are you suggesting that any president who owns a business that provides a good or a service, that they can't own something that has that potential? Do they have to divest their assets to become president?
What we try to do is require both transparency and, as the Constitution requires, congressional approval, so that we understand if there's an emolument being paid, and if there is, that Congress either approves or disapproves of it. But if Congress disapproves of it, then it can't be undertaken. from my point of view, anyone who wants to be the President of the United States needs to put the country first, not their business interests. And if they're unwilling to do it, they shouldn't run for president. One of the prevailing concerns I had about the last president, just to use one example, is he was trying to build a Trump Tower in Moscow. And if that project had been successful, according to the Mueller report, it could have earned him hundreds of millions of dollars. Would have been the most lucrative deal of his life. And they were in secret discussion with the Kremlin to try to make that deal happen while he was running for president and while he was lying about it to the country. And it may have been an object of his throughout his presidency when he left that office to consummate that deal. And the compromise might have been as simple as that he wanted to build that tower. He was not going to cross Putin as long as Putin made the ultimate decision about whether that deal would go forward. After all, at one point he said, hey, I might have lost my election. Why should I miss out on all those opportunities? Or words to that effect. And so there is a real risk when people are not willing to put their investments, assets in a trust, blind trust. There's a real risk to the country, and the country needs to understand those risks. And when it would violate the Constitution in the form of an emolument, the Constitution requires that the Congress approve it, and if not approved, then any benefit like that needs to be disgorged.
Are you concerned at all about the current president's family members making money basically on the Biden name, Hunter Biden selling his art, the brothers doing business?
I think we apply the same standard to any president of either party. And if any president's conduct violates the constitutional prohibition on emoluments, then there needs to be a mechanism to enforce it. And so this is one of the reasons why I say that this package of reforms is really party neutral, president neutral. It's a means of ensuring there's good government no matter who occupies that office.
Charlie Cook from Cook Political.
Thank you for coming. I was wondering if you could help us kind of reconcile and understand a very aggressive, ambitious, historic, transformational policy agenda that House Democrats are pushing hard on versus political circumstances that would seem to push the other way. A disappointing election, the president's job approval rating that's well below that of the last two Democratic presidents, or at this point that had disastrous midterms, generic ballot test, a candidate in Virginia that's struggling in a place where he ought to be ahead by 4 or 5 points and had many mistakes. It just seems like a circumstance that would suggest caution and incremental has gone historic and transformational, and I'm kind of having a hard time reconciling the two, understanding.
Well, I guess I would explain it this way, and you understand this phenomenon a lot better than I do. But if we look at where the country was, say, 30 years ago, and the number of House seats where the incumbent was of an opposite party of the president who won that district, it was a very large number. If you looked 15 years ago, it would have been half that number. If you look today, it's a little more than a dozen. We've become a much more partisan, polarized country, and I think in light of that, progress has really been stalled for a long time. For the last several decades, we've seen this incredible disparity in income grow and grow and grow. We've seen the middle class under greater and greater stress. I think that propelled a lot of the xenophobic populism we witnessed over the last 4 years. And I do think it means that when you do have an opportunity to govern, you have to make use of that opportunity. And one thing that Republicans did show in the last 4 years is that when they controlled the instruments of power, they could use it to move the country quite radically, and they did. That was radically in the wrong direction. But I don't think we can meet an effort to move the country radically in the wrong direction with incrementalism in the right direction. And so one of the other overarching challenges to our democracy, in my view, is that so many of our institutions are now counter-majoritarian. With the gerrymander, we're often going to have a situation where a minority of the country is controlling the House. We already have a situation where a minority of the country is controlling the Senate. And you layer on the filibuster to that, and you have minority rule upon minority rule. Given the way the Electoral College is now operating in the absence of a multi-state compact, we're often going to have times where the president represents a minority of Americans. And that, I think, is a real danger to the democracy. In my view, our party, my party, needs to have a midterm and long-term plan to change all of that, so that the House, the Senate, and the White House reflect the popular will. Until that happens, though, when we do control the instruments of power, we need to use it to effectuate the popular will, and do so in more than an incremental way. And so I also think that it's such a powerful and popular agenda that the policy imperative and the political one are intertwined. And the risk of doing too little, in my view, is much greater than the risk of doing too much. And I think that's true as a policy matter. I also think it's true politically. I don't think the base of the Democratic Party will support incrementalism. And I know I don't.
Story Hinckley from the Monitor, last question.
So you had just touched on this, but redistricting is going on in states right now, and you had just made a comment to the point of when you're in power, do what you can. And there were provisions in the For the People Act to address gerrymandering, and so I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how is the issue still a priority? If so, how could it be addressed at the congressional level? And being a representative and a congressman who has had his district redrawn, how difficult is it, even if you are relatively safe, to campaign and then govern a new constituency?
I think we sequenced our pro-democracy agenda in the right order. We began with HR 1 and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, because voting is the fundamental right, the foundational right on which everything else hangs. The Protecting Our Democracy Act is really important when you have functional ability to vote. But if you don't have a meaningful opportunity to vote, then the rest falls apart. And so in my view, compared to infrastructure, compared to protecting our democracy, compared to everything else we're doing, there's nothing more important than H.R. 1 and the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill. The efforts to suppress the vote around the country are shameful. The efforts to strip state independent elections officials of their powers and give them to partisan appointed boards is a dagger pointed at the heart of the democracy. They are attempting to do what they failed to do in the last presidential election, which is to overturn the result if they lose. To suppress the vote so they don't lose, but to have the capacity to overturn the election if they do. And to me, there's nothing more important than making sure that every American can vote. I understand also how the Build Back Better and infrastructure bills are a key democracy, part of the democracy agenda as well, because at the end of the day, the democracy needs to deliver. But I still believe that the most important priority is protecting the right to vote. And so I hope the White House is spending every hour on that and making every effort to get every senator to the point where they can explain to their constituents back home that we tried everything else, and if the filibuster got in the way, it cannot be used again to disenfranchise people of color. And that, to me, is a very easy case to make, and it should be in any part of the country. In terms of reapportionment, we have an opportunity through that bill, and this is one of the reasons why I think it's so important, to make sure the House always responds to the majority of the American people. And that means doing away with the gerrymander. And making the Senate representative is a more difficult task. It's quite simple in the House. And so time is time is fleeting here. States are already working on their maps, and so I also feel a very special urgency about H.R. 1. In terms of your last question about working on these issues while each of our districts are still indeterminate, that's a challenge for all of us that we face every 10 years. I like to say the only thing good about reapportionment is that it only comes around every 10 years.
All right, good. Well, we've reached the end of the hour. Thank you again for coming, and I hope to see you again.
Thank you again. Really, if I could just make one last point. I just want to thank you for all you do, because as tough as the last 4 years have been on those of us in Congress, it has been equally difficult for you in the press. You have been cast as the enemies of the people, and you're also a vital part of any pro-democracy agenda. And I think you've had a very hard job to hold the last administration to the same standard you hold to any other, without simply being cast as an opposition to the administration. But I don't think there's any other choice than to use the same standard for the truth or corruption or anything else. So I just want to express my appreciation as someone who almost 20 years ago formed a Freedom of the Press caucus with Mike Pence. I just want to reiterate how important I think your work is and how much I appreciate it. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.